Your father left everything to a woman none of you have ever met.
There's a room that most people only ever enter once in their lives. It is not a hospital room or a courtroom or a church. It is quieter than all of those. It is a lawyer's office on an ordinary weekday afternoon, with beige walls and a conference table and a box of tissues that someone placed there deliberately because someone always needs them. People come to this room after someone they loved has died, and they sit around that table and a lawyer reads them a document that tells them what the person they love decided to do with everything they spent their life building. Most of the time, what happens in that room is what everyone expected. Most of the time, the document confirms what the family already knew in the afternoon, ends with paperwork and quiet grief, and people driving home to begin the long work of rebuilding a life around an absence. But sometimes, what happens in that room is something else entirely. Sometimes the document contains a name that nobody in that room has ever heard. And sometimes that name comes attached to everything: the house, the savings, the business, the investments, everything that the family believed was theirs, everything they had organized their grief and their future around, transferred in a single legal sentence to a woman who walked into that lawyer's office from a completely different life and sat down at the same table and waited for the same document to tell her that she had won something she had never told anyone she was waiting for. That is what happened on a Tuesday afternoon in Houston, Texas. And by the time that lawyer finished reading, nothing in that room would ever be the same again. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you're not already subscribed to Behind the Lie, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in that conference room on that Tuesday afternoon, you need to understand the man who put everyone in it. You need to understand the life he built, the choices he made, and the particular kind of silence he maintained for 9 years that made a document signed 7 days before his death the loudest thing he ever said. His name, for the purposes of this story, was Walter. He was 71 years old when he died. He had built a construction business in Houston over the course of 40 years, starting in his late 20s with one truck and a reputation for showing up when he said he would and finishing what he started, and ending by his early 60s with a company that employed 22 people full-time and had completed contracts across the greater Houston area worth several $1 million in aggregate. He was not a famous man. He was not wealthy in the way that the word gets used loosely. But he had built something real and solid and lasting from the work of his own hands over 4 decades. And everyone who knew him understood that the business was not just how he made money. It was who he was. It was the physical record of what his life had amounted to. And he was proud of it in the quiet way of men who do not need to tell you what they have done because the evidence is standing in front of you. Walter had been married for 34 years to a woman named Barbara, who everyone who knew her described with the same set of words in the same order, which was warm and steady and the reason the whole thing worked. Barbara had been the kind of person around whom a family organizes itself without anyone explicitly deciding to do so, the gravitational center of every Sunday dinner and every holiday and every ordinary Tuesday that becomes, in retrospect, one of the days you would give anything to have back. She had died 12 years before this story reached its turning point, from a stroke at the age of 59 that arrived without warning on a Thursday morning while she was drinking coffee at the kitchen table of the house she and Walter had lived in for 26 years. Walter had found her. He had called 911. He had ridden in the ambulance. He had sat in a hospital waiting room for 4 hours before a doctor came out and told him what he had already, on some level, known from the moment he walked into that kitchen. He had gone home to the same house, and he had sat in the kitchen where it happened, and he had not left that house for 3 days. His children, who were grown and living their own lives in their own cities, had come home immediately. And when they left, when they eventually had to go back to their lives, Walter had stayed. In that house, with everything she had left behind, And he had been alone in a way that people who have lost a person who was the center of everything understand as a specific and particular kind of alone that does not respond to company or time in a way that ordinary grief does. Walter's three children were the people who, before that Tuesday in the conference room, believed they knew their father better than anyone alive. His eldest daughter was named Renee. She was 46 years old and had worked in a family construction business for 18 years, starting as an office manager in her late 20s and becoming, over the following decade and a half, the operational backbone of everything Walter had built. She handled the contracts and the scheduling and the relationships with the suppliers and the subcontractors, and she had done it with the kind of competence that made people forget it was being done at all, which is the highest compliment you can pay to someone in that kind of role. She had two children of her own, a marriage of 19 years, and a life that was deeply connected to the business and to her father in ways that she had never experienced as a burden because she had always understood them as a privilege. The business was going to be hers. That had been the understanding for years. Not a formal conversation exactly, but the kind of accumulated mutual understanding that develops between a parent and a child who have worked side by side for nearly 2 decades and know each other's rhythms and intentions the way that close collaborators do. She had organized her professional future around that understanding. She had made decisions based on it. She had turned down opportunities that might have taken her elsewhere because the plan was always that she was going to be here. Walter's second child was a son named David, 43 years old, who had built his own career in commercial real estate in Dallas and maintained the warm and slightly formalized relationship with his father that adult children sometimes develop when they love a parent deeply but have built their lives in a different city. He drove down from Dallas several times a year. He called every Sunday. He had been present at every important moment of Walter's life since Barbara died. And he had been, in his own way and from his own distance, watching his father more carefully in the years of declining health than Walter had probably realized. Walter's youngest was a daughter named Angela, 40 years old, a registered nurse at the Houston Medical Center who had been the family member most practically involved in managing Walter's medical care as his health had declined. She had accompanied him to appointments. She had spoken with his cardiologist. She had translated the clinical language of his diagnosis into the plain-spoken assessment of a daughter who understood exactly what the numbers meant and needed her family to understand too. She was the child Walter talked to most easily, in the way that parents sometimes develop a particular ease with one of their children that has nothing to do with preference and everything to do with temperament. She and Walter had a shorthand that the other two siblings recognized without resentment, the specific fluency that develops between two people who spend a lot of time in cars together, going to medical appointments, and talking about everything except what they are actually going to the appointment about. The construction business that Walter had spent 40 years building was worth, at the time of his death, approximately $3.4 million when the assets, equipment, contracts, and goodwill were properly assessed. The house in southwest Houston, the house where Barbara had died and where Walter had lived for 38 years, and where his children had grown up, and where the vegetable garden in the backyard had been Barbara's and then became Walter's after she was gone, was worth just over $400,000 in the Houston market at the time. The investment accounts and savings accumulated over decades of a man who spent carefully and saved consistently totaled approximately $800,000. Walter had an original will drawn up 11 years earlier, shortly after Barbara's death, when the practical reality of mortality had pressed itself into his life in the unavoidable way it does when the person closest to you has just died. That will have left everything in equal thirds to his 3 children, with specific provisions designating Renee as the executor and establishing a framework for the transfer of the business that had been discussed with all 3 of them and that they understood and accepted. They had seen copies of it. They remembered it. They had, over the 11 years since it was written, organize their understanding of the future around it in the particular way that families do when they believe the important conversations have been had and the important documents have been signed. They had no reason to believe anything had changed. They were wrong. Walter had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure 14 months before his death. The diagnosis had been delivered to him by his cardiologist with the measured directness of a doctor who has learned that giving people the truth plainly is kinder in the long run than softening it into something that takes longer to understand. The doctor had told Walter what the condition was, what the progression typically looked like, and what the options for management were. He had prescribed medications. He had outlined lifestyle adjustments. He had been clear that compliance with a treatment protocol was the most significant factor in determining how much time and quality of life Walter could expect. Angela had been in the room for that appointment. She had taken notes. She had asked the follow-up questions that needed asking. She had driven her father home, and they had sat in the parking lot of his house for a while without going inside. The way people sometimes sit in cars when they need time to let something settle before they walk back into the life that now contains a new and heavy fact. Walter had been, by his own admission in subsequent appointments, inconsistent with his medications, not in a defiant way, in the quiet way of a man who sometimes forgot and sometimes chose not to remember, which is a different thing, and which Angela recognized as the difference between forgetfulness and a kind of passive negotiation with the terms of his own ending. 6 days before Walter died, on a Monday morning in October, he got dressed at 7 in the morning, got into his truck, and drove to the office of a probate and estate attorney in a part of Houston that his children had no connection to and no reason to visit. The attorney has confirmed in subsequent legal proceedings that Walter arrived alone and on time for an appointment he had made by phone the previous week. He was alert and oriented and coherent. He explained what he wanted with the precise and organized language of a man who had spent 40 years running a business and understood the importance of being specific when something mattered. He wanted a new will. He wanted it to supersede the existing document entirely. He wanted it drawn up, witnessed, and legally executed before the end of the week. The attorney asked him the standard questions that attorneys are required to ask in these circumstances, the questions about mental competence and voluntary intent and the absence of outside pressure, and Walter answered all of them without hesitation and without apparent difficulty. He then provided the specific instructions for the document he wanted prepared. The new will remove the equal three-way split entirely. It removed the business provisions that Renee had understood for 18 years to be the framework of her professional future. It left each of Walter's 3 children a cash sum that was meaningful in the way that the attorney characterized it during later depositions, but that everyone who eventually heard the number described in terms that cannot be repeated on this channel, because the number was not what they had expected, and the distance between what they had expected and what was in the document was the specific distance across which the entire structure of their relationship with their father would have to be re-examined. The remainder of the estate, the house, and the savings and the investment accounts and the business and everything else was transferred in its entirety to a woman named Lorraine. The will described her as his partner of 9 years and the person to whom he owed a debt of love and honesty that he had not been able to repay during his lifetime. Walter signed the document on Wednesday of that week. It was witnessed by 2 members of the attorney's staff. It was filed with the probate court on Thursday. Walter died in his sleep on Saturday morning. He was gone before any of his children arrived at the house that day. The discovery that a second will existed happened 9 days after Walter's death, when Renee contacted Walter's original attorney to begin the process of settling the estate, and the attorney received a notice from another office indicating that a competing document had been filed. He called Renee. He used the words that Renee has described in every subsequent account of this story as the words that changed the temperature of everything. He said that she should prepare herself, that the new document had been properly executed and filed, and that the probate court would need to be involved, that she should get her own legal representation before any further steps were taken. Renee sat in her car after that phone call for a long time. She has said that the specific quality of the stillness she felt in that car was different from the stillness of grief, which she had been living inside since her father died, and different from the stillness of shock, which she had experienced in various forms over the previous 9 days. It was the stillness of a woman whose mind was doing a kind of rapid and involuntary accounting, going back through 11 years of a shared professional and personal life with her father, and trying to identify the moment or the series of moments that she had somehow failed to see. She did not find a moment. She did not find a series of moments. She found what people almost always find when they go looking for the evidence they missed, which is that the evidence was not there to find because the person who was keeping the secret was very careful and very practiced and had been doing it for a very long time. Lorraine was 54 years old. She had grown up in Beaumont, Texas, moved to Houston in her late 20s, and spent the subsequent decades building the quiet, self-sufficient life of a woman who had learned to be content with what she had and had not wasted energy grieving what she did not. She worked as a bookkeeper for several small businesses in the northwest corridor of the city, a job that suited her temperament, which was precise and reliable and comfortable in the background of other people's enterprises. She owned her own house. She had a small circle of close friends who described her with consistency as private and loyal, and the kind of person who showed love in steady, consistent action rather than in announcements. None of those friends had ever heard Walter's name. In 9 years, through dinners and birthdays and the ordinary social occasions that make up a life, Lorraine had never mentioned him in any context to any person who was not already aware of the relationship. She had maintained a silence about the most significant relationship of her adult life that was so complete and so sustained that the people who loved her found it, when they eventually learned the full story, more bewildering than almost anything else about the situation. Not the will, not the 9 years, the silence. The 9 years of silence. Walter and Lorraine had met at a grief support group that met weekly at a church in Southwest Houston. Walter had been attending the group irregularly since Barbara's death, in the way that people sometimes attend things that help them without fully committing to the idea that they need help. Lorraine had started attending after the death of her mother, who had been the central relationship of her life up to that point, and whose loss had left her with a particular kind of emptiness that she had not known how to address through the ordinary channels available to her. They had recognized something in each other at those meetings in the specific way that people who are carrying a similar weight sometimes do, not because the weight is identical, but because they have both learned the same posture from carrying it. They had begun talking after meetings. They had begun meeting for coffee separately from the group. Over the following year, the coffee had become something more, and by the end of that year, they had a relationship that both of them understood was real and significant and worth protecting, which was where their interpretations of what protection required had apparently diverged in a way that would not be fully understood until a lawyer read a document aloud in a conference room in Houston 9 years later. Walter had told Lorraine, in the early period of their relationship, that he was not ready to introduce her to his children. He said he was still grieving Barbara and needed more time. Lorraine had understood this. She was grieving for her own mother. She knew what it meant to need more time. She had given him the time, and then more time had passed, and the introduction had not happened, and the reasons had shifted in the way that reasons tend to shift when the original reason is no longer fully accurate, but a new and more honest reason is not something the person is ready to name. Walter had told her it was complicated, that his children were protective of Barbara's memory, that the business and the family were intertwined in ways that made new relationships difficult to introduce without disrupting something that was still fragile. Lorraine had accepted these explanations because she had no specific reason to reject them, and because she loved him, and because the alternative, which was to demand an ultimatum from a man in his late 60s who had lost his wife and was managing a family and a business and a declining health, felt like a demand she did not have the right to make. So she stayed. She had been present in his life in every private way. She had sat with him through the early stages of his diagnosis. She had driven him to appointments that Angela did not attend. She had been the person he called when the fear of what the illness meant was too large to carry alone. She had been, in every meaningful emotional sense, his partner. And she had been invisible to every person in his life who was not himself. The reading of the will was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon, 9 days after Walter's death. Renee, David, and Angela arrived together, accompanied by the probate attorney they had retained in the days following Renee's conversation with Walter's original lawyer. They walked into the conference room and stopped when they saw a woman they had never seen before sitting on the other side of the table with her own attorney beside her. The accounts of what that moment felt like vary depending on who is describing it, but they agree on the essentials. There was a recognition that the situation was exactly as serious as they had been warned. There was the particular disorientation of looking at a stranger and understanding that she was not a stranger to your father. And there was, in Renee's account particularly, the precise sensation of 18 years of professional loyalty and personal devotion being held suddenly in a new and unfamiliar light, not because something had been added to the picture that changed what the whole thing looked like. Lorraine was composed. She did not make immediate eye contact. She had the stillness of a woman who had spent 9 years learning to be invisible and who was now, for the first time, in a room where everyone could see her, and who had decided that she was going to meet that visibility with the same composure with which she had met everything else. The lawyers took their positions. The document was produced, and the reading began. What the will said, in the formal and precise language of a legal document that had been carefully drafted by a competent attorney, was this. Walter had left his entire estate, with the exception of the individual cash sums designated for each of his 3 children, to Lorraine. The document described her as his partner and used a specific phrase that every person in that room would carry with them out of that building, and that would be repeated in every subsequent conversation about what had happened. The phrase was this: a debt of love and honesty that he had failed to repay during his lifetime and was attempting, in the only way available to him, to address now. When the lawyer reached that phrase and read it aloud, the room did something that several people present have described in similar terms. It went still in a way that rooms rarely go still, a collective cessation of the small ambient movements and sounds that fill space when people are merely uncomfortable, a stillness that arrives only when something has been said that everyone in the room understands they will be thinking about for a very long time. David asked, quietly and with the restraint of a man holding something much larger than his composure would suggest, what debt was being referenced. The lawyer said he was not in a position to interpret the document beyond its reading. Angela covered her mouth with her hand and looked at a point on the wall above the lawyer's head for a long time. And Renee said, into the silence that followed, with the particular flatness of a woman who is asking a question she does not want answered but understands she has to ask, "Who is she?" Lorraine answered. She said she had been with Walter for 9 years, that the relationship had been continuous throughout that time, that Walter had told her in the early years that he was not ready to make introductions, and that as the years passed and the introductions did not come, she had understood that they were not going to come, and that she had made a choice to stay anyway because she loved him, and that she had not known about the will until a week before his death when his attorney had called her and asked her to come in, and that she had spent the 9 days between that call and this room in a state of reckoning with what the document meant and what she was going to do about it. She said she had not asked for it. She said she had not suggested it. She said she believed Walter had done it because he had run out of other ways to say the thing he had spent 9 years failing to say, which was that she was real to him, that she mattered, that the silence had not been indifference, but an inability he had not been able to overcome while he was alive. David asked her why she had never reached out to the family directly. She said she had not known if she would be welcome. Angela asked her whether Walter had ever suggested he intended to change the will. Lorraine said no. She said she believed he did it because he was running out of time to do anything else. The room was quiet. Then Renee picked up her copy of the document, put it in her bag, and stood up and walked out of the conference room without saying anything further to anyone. The legal challenge was filed within 2 weeks. Renee was the primary petitioner. David joined the challenge. The grounds were undue influence, the argument being that Lorraine had exerted pressure on Walter during the final week of his life, when he was physically diminished by illness and emotionally vulnerable in the particular way that people are vulnerable when they know they are close to the end. The challenge required a probate attorney and a court filing and the beginning of a process that would eventually produce, over the following 7 months, more information about Walter's life and his relationship with Lorraine than his children had known or suspected. It is a documented and frequently cited fact in Texas probate law that the majority of contested estate cases involve a surviving spouse or partner on one side and the deceased children on the other. According to estate attorneys who work in this area regularly, undue influence is one of the most common grounds for challenging a will, and it is also one of the most difficult to prove because the law in Texas, as in most states, holds that a person of sound mind has the right to leave their estate to whoever they choose, including a person their family has never met, and that the size of the surprise does not by itself constitute evidence that something improper occurred. The attorney Walter had documented his mental competence at the time of signing with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the document he was preparing was likely to be challenged and had taken the appropriate precautions. The challenge was going to be difficult. Renee's attorney told her this from the beginning. She filed anyway, because the alternative was to accept a document that had removed 18 years of her professional life and her understanding of her own future in a single legal sentence. And that was not something she was prepared to accept without a fight. The discovery process, which is the phase of litigation during which each side produces documents and information relevant to the case, began in the 3rd month after the will was filed. And it was during the discovery process that something was found that changed the direction of everything. Among Walter's personal papers, located in a locked box in the study of his home, was a collection of materials that told the story of the 9 years with Lorraine in considerably more detail than anyone had been given in the conference room. There were letters, handwritten on plain note paper, in Walter's distinctive large and slightly unsteady handwriting that had become more pronounced as his health declined. These letters had never been sent. They were addressed to Lorraine, but had clearly never left that locked box. And the attorneys handling the discovery process understood immediately that they were looking at something that had not been intended as evidence, but that was going to function as evidence regardless. Because the law does not distinguish between the documents a person intends to be found and the documents they intend to keep private when those documents are relevant to a legal proceeding. The letters spanned the 9 years of the relationship. The earliest were tentative and searching in the way of a man who is trying to understand something about himself that does not yet have clear language. The later ones were more settled and more painful in equal measure. They describe a man who was caught between 2 versions of himself that he had never found a way to reconcile. The version who had built everything with Barbara and raised 3 children and created a family that had a particular shape and a particular set of demands and expectations that he had never been willing to disrupt. And the version who had found, 9 years after Barbara's death, a person who had made the future feel like a place worth going to again for the first time since he had sat in that hospital waiting room and been told that the person who had been the center of everything was gone. He wrote about his inability to bring those 2 versions into the same room. He wrote about the conversations he had not had and the introductions he had not made. He wrote about telling himself that there would be more time. He wrote about understanding, with increasing clarity in the letters from the final 2 years, that the time he had been telling himself was not going to come the way he had imagined, and that the things he had not done were not going to get done, and that the debt he had incurred toward Lorraine through 9 years of choosing silence over honesty was a debt he did not know how to repay while he was still alive to repay it. In the most recent letter, dated approximately 8 weeks before his death, He wrote something that Renee has said she has returned to many times since she first read it in the discovery documents and has never been able to read without sitting with it for a long time afterward. He wrote that he knew he had been a coward. He wrote that he had loved two women, one for 34 years and one for 9. He wrote that he had honored the first one fully and failed the second one completely, and that he did not know how to fix that in the time he had left. He wrote that he was sorry. And then the letter ended without a closing, the way letters do when the person writing them did not know yet what they wanted to say and ran out of time before they found out. Angela's role in all of this became the subject of a separate, and in some ways, more painful revelation in the 5th month of the legal proceedings, when she gave a deposition in which she disclosed that she had known about Lorraine for 2 years before Walter's death. Walter had told her, not in a single formal conversation, but in the way that a father sometimes tells the child he trusts most about the things he cannot bring himself to say to the whole family, in increments, over the course of the drives to and from medical appointments that Angela had been accompanying him to as his condition worsened. He had told her about Lorraine. He had told her that the relationship was real and had been real for a long time. He had told her that he had handled it badly and that he knew it, and that he was trying to figure out what to do. He had asked Angela not to say anything to Renee and David yet, because he was going to tell them himself when he could figure out how to do it right. Angela had agreed. She had carried that knowledge for 2 years. Through Sunday dinners, through the family phone calls about his health, through the organizing of his care and the conversations about his future. She had watched Renee talk about the business and her plans for it with the warmth and confidence of a woman who believed she understood her father's intentions. And she had said nothing because her father had asked her to say nothing, and she had honored that request with the particular loyalty of a child who trusts a parent's judgment, even when something in her is uncertain about whether the judgment is sound. When Renee found out during the deposition, the effect on the relationship between the two sisters was immediate and significant. It was, as both of them have since described it, the secondary wound of the entire experience. Not the will, not Walter's secret life with Lorraine. Angela's silence. The discovery that the person she had trusted most within the family had been keeping the same information as her father, for the same duration, for reasons that were understandable in isolation and devastating in their aggregate effect. The sisters did not speak for 6 weeks after that deposition. What nobody in the legal proceedings anticipated was what Lorraine did in the 4th month. She contacted Renee directly through her attorney with a request for a meeting with no lawyers present. Renee agreed. They met at a restaurant in Houston on a Wednesday morning. 2 women who had both loved the same man and had both been failed in entirely different ways and at entirely different costs by his inability to be honest with the people around him. Lorraine told Renee that she had not known the will was being changed until a week before Walter's death, that she had not suggested it or encouraged it, that the claim of undue influence was not accurate, and that she would testify to that under oath. She said she had spent 4 months inside a legal proceeding that was exhausting and painful, and that was, she believed, not what Walter had intended. She said she believed Walter had changed the will not as a strategic act, but as a final and desperate gesture from a man who had run out of other ways to say what he should have said years earlier. She said she knew that the money and the house and the business were a substitution for the thing she had actually needed from him, which was the acknowledgement, the introduction, the willingness to say to his children and to the world that she existed in his life and that her existence was real and mattered to him. That was what she had needed and had not received. And she believed that Walter had known it too, and that the will was his way of saying, from the only place he had left to speak from, that he was sorry for the substitution. She then told Renee that she was willing to negotiate a settlement, that she did not want the business, that she did not want the house, which was Barbara's house and had been Barbara's house, and should remain with the people who knew it that way. She said what she wanted was simple and could not be delivered by any legal document. She wanted it acknowledged, formally and on the record, that she had been real, that the 9 years had happened, that Walter had loved her. That was what she wanted. Everything else was negotiable. The settlement was reached out of court in the 7th month of the proceedings. The specific financial terms are confidential, as settlements in probate matters typically are. What both parties have confirmed publicly is that the business was transferred to the family with a financial settlement paid to Lorraine, and that the house was handled in a manner consistent with what she had proposed in that Wednesday morning conversation. The legal acknowledgement she had asked for was part of the settlement agreement. It is a brief document, formal in its language, but clear in its meaning, that states that Walter maintained a relationship with Lorraine for 9 years prior to his death, that the relationship was genuine and significant to him, and that the absence of that relationship from his family's knowledge was the result of his own choices and not a reflection of its reality or its importance. Lorraine has a copy of that document. She has said it is the thing she values most from the entire proceeding. Not the settlement, the acknowledgement, the piece of paper that says she was real. Renee has said, in the months since, that she has had to learn to hold two things simultaneously that do not sit comfortably together. The first is that her father deceived her. Not in the dramatic way of a man who built a secret family or stole from his children or deliberately caused harm. In the quieter and in some ways more insidious way of a man who withheld information that she had a right to have for years, because giving her that information would have required him to have a conversation that he was not brave enough to have. The second thing is that her father loved her, that the 18 years of working beside him were real, that the business they built together was real, that the Sunday dinners and the phone calls and the vegetable garden in the backyard and the particular way he said her name when he was proud of something she had done, all of it was real. She has said that the discovery of Lorraine did not erase those things, but it did change the frame around them, and she is still, in her own words, getting used to looking at her father's life in the new frame and finding in it both less and more than she had before. David has said less publicly and is still working through it in his own way, which is the right of anyone who has been through something that takes time and does not resolve on a schedule. Angela and Renee are rebuilding. It is slow, as the rebuilding of trust between people who love each other but have been put in impossible positions by someone they both trusted always is. But it is happening. Lorraine has a photograph of Walter on the mantle of her house in Northwest Houston. It is a photograph someone took of the two of them at a restaurant, one of the restaurants where they met over the 9 years, and in it they're both laughing at something that is happening outside the frame. She is not taken down. She has said that she does not intend to. She has said that whatever the rest of it was, whatever the complexity and the cost and the 9 years of choosing to be invisible in someone else's life, the love in that photograph was real. And she's not going to pretend otherwise simply because the circumstances that surrounded it were imperfect. She said, in the only extended interview she has given since the settlement, that what she wished most was not what most people assume she would wish. She did not wish she had never met Walter. She did not wish she had demanded more earlier or walked away sooner. She wished that one Sunday, on one of the many ordinary Sundays of those 9 years, Walter had called Renee and David and Angela and said, "There is someone I would like you to meet." She wished that because she believed and still believes that it would not have destroyed anything, that the family could have held it, that the children who loved their father would have found a way to understand, and that the letter he wrote in the locked box, the letter about being a coward, the letter he never sent, would never have needed to be written at all. That was the debt, not the money, not the house, not the business. The Sunday afternoon phone call that never happened. That was what 9 years of silence actually cost. And it was Walter, in the end, who paid the least of it. So here's the question I want to leave you with before we close today. Because every story on this channel ends with a question, and this one has more than most. We talk a lot in our culture about the right to privacy, about a person's right to manage their own story and share it on their own timeline. And those are real rights that deserve real respect. But this story asks us to sit with the other side of that, The side that asks what the people who love you are owed, not your entire interior life, not every feeling and every complication and every version of yourself you have ever been, but the information that directly shapes their lives. The information that they are making decisions around without knowing they do not have the full picture. Is that information theirs? Does the person who withholds it have the right to call the withholding kindness? Or is there a point at which the kindness we tell ourselves we are extending to others is actually only the kindness we are extending to ourselves, the kindness of never having to watch the people we love respond to the truth while we are still around to see it? Walter answered that question in a letter in a locked box with a single word: cowardice. He used it about himself. He knew what it was, and he ran out of time to do anything about it except write a document that said so. Tell me in the comments what you think. Was Walter's secret understandable or unforgivable? And if you had been Renee or Lorraine or Angela, which of them do you think had the hardest road? I read every single one. And subscribe to Behind the Lie and turn on that notification bell, because next time we are going into the story of a mother-in-law who changed the locks on her son's house while his wife was in the hospital after giving birth. And what that wife did when she came home to a different key is something that the entire neighborhood remembers to this day. We will see you there.